don't keep like seeing myself move.
Sure.
Yeah, that's okay. Or I'll be really self-conscious.
好啦，我哋開始啦。
Hello, came out.
Okay, you can actually start.
有冇太慢？
太冷
我可以收
10加10。
Okay, quick.
開始啦，
係
而家10分鐘係咪？
係。2-2-1-2-1要舉
Wait, 2 minutes.
2 minutes 同1 minute 係唔該。
我哋
10 minutes 我 manually 啦。
My dad loves fishing. He always say that it's the epitome of life because you can pick a great pool, you can train up your fishing skills, and pick the right bait. But after all, there are still so many factors that you cannot control. And we see that today, it's also the same case in the renewable energy landscape, which is why we bring to you a new perspective with our Unlock Potential strategy. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're Sundial Consulting. I'm Joyce, and I'm here with my colleagues Tony, Abby, and Jonathan. Today, we see that the New Zealand wind energy market is really on a great growth because especially we're moving towards the target 2035, where entire New Zealand will be powered by renewable energies. However, New Zealand wind farm is particularly suffering huge loss over the past few years. And we see that this is based on two factors. Fundamentally, New Zealand wind farm really has minimal control over the top line. In terms of price, we see that we currently only act as a generator selling to the wholesale market. What it means is that apart from the price fluctuation because of the wind energy nature, this market is also controlled by government. So we have minimal control in terms of determining the price. Now, second of all, in terms of quantity, both demand and supply are pretty much scoped within the geographic, limited within the geographic scope that we are set with within this wind farm design, and which is why there's also limited room for expansion. So if we look at what you have done over the past year, we realize that it's mainly focused on driving the operation efficiency. And indeed, these initiatives really drive up and achieve a turnaround in 2018. However, we also see that shareholders do not really respond to this turnaround in 2018, despite our EBITDA turnaround. What it means is that shareholders actually do not only care about profitability, but the long-term outlook. And because operation efficiency efforts are really short-term and not a strategic move to really unlock and capture the wind energy sector potential, we see that today they're really looking for something that is more strategic. So this leads us to our key question today. How can we strategically increase the shareholders' value in the long term? I'll now pass the time to Tony to explain our recommendation.
Thank you, Joyce. Now that we understand our goal going forward is to improve on the shareholders' value. Therefore, our going forward, the objective will be to enhance the longer-term capability to drive cash flow. And factoring in the operational consideration, we see two primary ways going forward. Firstly is to optimize the market price, which is subject to fluctuation and sensitivity in the market. Secondly is to optimize the return on assets, namely our wind turbines and our wind farms. Now, if we take a look at the first part, which is to optimize our market price, we see two primary considerations going forward. Firstly is to stay in our wholesale market, and secondly is to venture into the retail segment. Now, if we look into the wholesale market, we see that we're pretty much a price taker, meaning that we're really subject to the fluctuation of the price. Even though a lot of our positions has already been hedged, we see very little room going forward to further improve on the wholesale landscape. Now, if we decided to venture into retail, what we see is that it's really attractive because there's a fixed price over there. However, it usually comes at a cost of huge cash burning, meaning that we constantly need to give this household rebate in order to successfully sign them on board. And as a small company, we see that this is no sustainable way for us to adopt this strategy going forward. It seems that there hasn't been any available way going forward, but is that really true? Now, what we see is that in the utility industry, a dynamic of clustering or economies of scales definitely kicks in. And therefore, we see that even though we ourselves cannot necessarily maneuver through these challenges, we do see that we present huge values to strategic investors, such as those who actually operate in this exact industry. So these values can be explained in two primary factors. First of all is when you hold a huge portfolio consisting of different renewable energies, or even not renewable, just energy in general, you can actually have a huge improvement on the P90 score, which is the industry skill score, on the fact of the total energy that you can generate at 90% of the time. And secondly is that we actually present a huge intrinsic asset value, namely our wind turbines, wind farms, as well as our prime location. And so therefore, we do believe that we have huge values to these potential strategic investors. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're really proud to present to you our privatization strategy. Ultimately, we see this as a pathway to unlock our asset potential. How exactly are we going to do that? Now, we need to take a look at our second part of our consideration, which is to improve on the return on assets. Now, we see this as a really important metric because it will have an impact chain guiding us back to the increase on the shareholders' value. How exactly are we going to do that? We consider three major tactics. First of all, upgrade. By upgrade, we mean we want to upgrade, for example, our wind turbines or whatnot. But we see that this incurs huge capex and is really hard to execute. So this is probably not how we're going to do going forward. Secondly is to diversify. Currently, we're running on wind farm, and we see that there's all different kind of sources of renewable out there. However, since for these renewable energy is highly constrained due to the geographical location you're in, this method we also don't see feasible going forward. And lastly is repower, which is a uniquely positioned for privatization that we want to introduce to you. So how exactly does this repowering works? So we see that the process is threefold. First of all, you are going to find a technical advisor to evaluate what is the lifespan of your wind farms. And secondly, we're going to negotiate for an extension on these PPA, which is power purchasing agreements with the governments, specifically the state-owned grid. And lastly, we want to negotiate for a contract renewal on these following items, specifically blade condition, warranty, as well as operational, as well as maintenance clauses. Now, what this will translate into is an increase in value that we can see for our company. Noted that these values are the present values of the additional 10 years of productivity that we can drive, discounted back to what we see today. So now Avi will walk you through how exactly are we going to find buyers and how to execute the entire strategy.
Perfect. Thank you, Tony. So in order, of course, to successfully privatize any sort of company, we need to understand what sort of buyers we're looking for. And we want to make this very simple. So we looked at, first of all, what type of buyer we want. We compared, of course, strategic or financial buyers, and given that we're looking at a very long-term investment, we sort of ruled out financial buyers from this because we're looking for strategic buyers that can stay with us and actually grow value. Looking at buyer location, we then considered two other things. Should we go for a local strategic buyers, or should we go with someone from overseas? Now, the overseas perspective or that rationale can be very strong because, of course, we have prime location in New Zealand being one of the top-performing wind industries in the world. But, of course, looking at the local aspect, there were other three rationales we wanted to pinpoint. Number one, there's already a strong growing local appetite for capacity for wind turbines, and that can be seen by existing energy providers increasing their consents for wind turbine and wind farms as a whole. Secondly, as Tony mentioned, the portfolio benefits that come with diversifying and expanding your scale of operations. And number three is a social consideration. This is a very important factor for NZWF, and it's the fact that you want to take care of New Zealand as a whole, and you have a social factor that's involved, which overseas buyers may not consider. Moving on from this, within the local strategic buyer bucket, we identified three core categories to focus on. The first being existing providers with wind competencies already, or providers with renewable competencies, and thirdly, traditional energy providers. Now, these are three different categories with each their own three different rationale points for buying in. The first one focuses more on asset quality and, of course, the prime location that we have that we've already emphasized. Moving onward, of course, we have the diversification element, which is another key rationale. Our key timeline moving on from this is, first of all, we have to ensure that we have, of course, negotiate with Vector, host the roadshow, and plan out our filtration process to take in around, we're expecting 30 potential buyers at the beginning and filtering down that to around one buyer by the end of 1 year. I'll pass it now on to Jonathan to discuss the financials.
Thank you, Avi. So looking into our business, we expect there are three factors driving our EBITDA growth. The first one is we are able to enjoy the increase in our electricity purchase price by around 3% going forward, and the electricity consumption due to population growth will also grow at around 2%. We're also able to realize our operating efficiency going forward by around 3%, reaching around $5 million New Zealand dollars by 2020. Now, our analysis in terms of the sponsor return, we expect we are able to sell at around EV/EBITDA of 12.3 times in terms of 2020 EV/EBITDA, and our sponsor return would be at around IRR of around 16.1% for our sponsors. Now, we have also identified several key risks. One key risk is that Vector actually currently holds around 20% of our stake, and how we're going to mitigate that is we're going to engage in active conversations with them going forward and persuade them to actually sell it. So, ladies and gentlemen, today we realized that NZWF is actually at a very, very difficult position. But with our strategies, we are able to find a unique way going forward. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, please join us today, implement change, and bring NWZF to a new level. Thank you very much. We're now looking forward to it. I have less time than I expected.
So there's still time, 10 minutes Q&A, and then we might continue.
Okay, sure.
So maybe to start, so in terms of the pitching buyout, do you have prioritization across the three types of buyers, or you are just talking to each category?
Sure. I think we are currently prioritizing with buyers that currently are in the energy space, but they are not currently in the wind energy space because, as we have mentioned, the portfolio effect will only be very strong, especially if they are, for example, geothermal players or even solar players. Having that kind of wind asset as a starting point, because we also mentioned the 2035 vision of having 100% renewables energy in New Zealand, we believe the portfolio effect would be particularly strong for these type of buyers.
Okay, but you're not ruling out the other two categories, or so you are recommending that we talk to existing renewable companies without wind?
Well, so as Amy had mentioned, I think we're looking into a relatively targeted buyer list, but we are also going to target to around 20 buyers, which is very limited in terms of process. And then we're going to narrow it down in the phase 1 and phase 2 bidding process.
Maybe I'll add a question on selling the idea of selling the company. Why do you immediately rule out the financial sponsors? Have you considered a mix of financial sponsors together with corporations?
So we see that today, in terms of profitability, we understand that you have been doing a lot. And we also see that today our major concern is actually to drive up the shareholder value. And the current gap that we're missing here is that we were looking to drive up profitability, but not essentially with a strategic focus. So we see that today, if we go for a financial investor, yes, indeed, it may improve our profitability, but at the same time, it may not be the best in terms of our strategic goals, which is what the shareholders really value at this moment.
Is it 100% buyout that you're looking at?
Yes, we are looking for a 100% buyout, especially for a strategic investor. We believe 100% would make sense because the wind farm as a whole would better benefit their entire portfolio, only around 100%. But also we are open to other considerations based on the management if they are considering a role.
What would happen to our existing management if it's 100%
We believe Avi can talk a little bit more about the incentive plan, but we believe the management has the asset of being very knowledgeable with our wind farm, and because of the asset quality, we believe the management staying would be beneficial to the buyer as well.
And just adding on to that, when we of course sell to, we're targeting towards either traditional energy providers that don't have access to renewables yet, which of course is in line with what New Zealand government is pushing for, or alternative renewable sources such as solar, geothermal, etc. They don't have access to the existing wind competencies that we have at NZWF. And so really it's incentive for the management because they get to be retained through, for instance, an incentive program that the new buyer, the new investor can actually be pouring into. And because of that competence that already exists, it makes sense for them to continue with the new investor.
Sorry, I kind of missed on this slide. So there are three parties, and Emily asked which one you would give priority to, and you answered renewable company. Just want to check. So it is very generic categorization. Can you narrow down to, you say 30 potential buyers that you're considering? Can you give me more characteristics of those potential buyers you will consider? Because it's very high level.
Right. I think we look into players, for example, Genesis. They already have a lot of renewables in the space, and for example, they also have like geothermal assets, and they also have solar assets in New Zealand. And we believe that going forward, these kind of buyers can actually incorporate our asset into their portfolio as well. And secondly, when we're talking about selecting buyers, we want to definitely maximize the shareholder return on the first place. So obviously, the buyers with the highest bid would win the selection. Also considering other factors, for example, social considerations.
Just to add on a bit, on top of the fact that we do have multiple sources of renewable sources, what we also look for is whether they have the distribution networks, primarily the retailing sector that we talk about. Since currently we're only at wholesale, we believe that the combination of wholesale and retail definitely adds on to the portfolio effect that we talked about earlier.
So you mentioned that maybe in terms of, okay, for these type of company, it would be attractive strategically for them to add wind. But then within wind, why would they think us as favorable?
We see that within the wind energy sector, the location is actually a very, very key factor. So of course, our equipment, our current turbines, they are all up to like quality standard. But on top of that, our prime location is actually something that is rather irreplaceable to add to their portfolio currently. And on top of that, the consensus that is needed comparing to these players building an entire new wind farm from scratch, that would be an additional benefit for them.
But in order for them to feel that it is attractive to buy us, like us as a company, then with all the regulatory challenges, with like the price, like when it's more windy and then the supply increases and then the energy price immediately decreases. This is a fundamental industry challenge, and just selling out the company wouldn't solve this problem. So I'm thinking, why would, for example, Genesis would want to consider us, because with all these existing regulatory and the landscape challenge, that is not solved. How
Right.
did it solve our problem?
So I think adding on to what we've been discussing, this is the beauty where the portfolio factors really comes in. So as you said, of course, we see that, for example, under wind turbines itself, or under wind energy itself, it certainly is a fact where, for example, it becomes more windy. When there's more production, the price drops. But now that, for example, we have these big companies on board, they also have geothermal, solar energy, hydropowers. When all these factors comes in together, essentially they're generating their peak production at different seasons or at different time of the year. So we see that by really spreading out all those peak productions, we can achieve price stability. That's how essentially this portfolio factor kicks in.
I guess adding on to that, there are a number of key technologies that aren't in place right now, but will be in place in the next 5 to 10 years. An example of that being energy storage. And one of the key things that happens when you have price fluctuations.
So we don't have the money to.
Exactly. So that's something that's not feasible within our range, first of all, at this point in time, and also within our current budget. But it may make sense for a future investor to come in and say, hey, wind is really the future. It's perfect in New Zealand as a position. And in the future, let's say we want to build out some footprint in the wind. And of course, we're not going to be if they're really looking at expanding wind, we're not going to be the only person they talk to. They want to be investing in different parts and different geographies of New Zealand. That's how wind works. You have to identify different geographies. And going back to what Joyce mentioned, location is one of the prime key success factors for attracting any sort of customer. So I want to make sure I clarify two things. One thing is the fact that these investors that come in will not only be looking at us. There's no way to perfectly market and say we're special, we're better than anybody else, because at the end of the day, this energy that we're producing is commoditized.
Then why? Okay, then moving on. Why is it must be 100% sellout rather than like Michelle asked? Why can't we be just partial and we own, for example, 40-some% of the shareholder holding? Why do we need to go for 100% sellout?
Sure. There are two key considerations. I think the first consideration is that we are not a very large wind farm. For a lot of large players, they see us as a part of their business, and if we don't sell 100% to them, it's very difficult to justify them to actually enter the process, because entering the process actually costs them a year as well. There are a lot of costs. They need to hire advisors and so on. So it's very difficult for them. The second part is also we're definitely open for rollover, as we've mentioned. Management rollover is an option. However, when we are talking about maximizing shareholder value, we believe that the company is incapable currently to actually fully realize the potential that they have, and that's why we believe that letting the buyer purchase as many shares would actually
Wait a
benefit
second.
us.
If you don't think a management team can run this business, how would it be like turned around in terms of business after it sell it to a new investor? Like you said, the investor probably might not be the Wind Energy management team.
Let us clarify here. We do trust absolutely the expertise of your wind farm. What we're talking about here is actually the natural limitations of our company scale at the moment. Because we're so small, what it means is that we cannot tap into the portfolio effect that we mentioned earlier. And second of all, we do not also have the budget to really expand organically. So this is what stops us to really have that natural compensation effect that we mentioned, which is actually the key to really be profitable in this naturally unstable renewable energy landscape. So what we're talking about here is that we trust the expertise, but we need something that can help us build the scale rapidly to really be profitable.
I also want to ask, do you have a two-pronged strategy? So the first part about repower, can you elaborate on that? Because I kind of get, okay, you eventually want to find a buyer, but then what's the first part about repower?
Right. So ultimately, everything is under the umbrella of privatization. And of course, when we talk about privatization, we have to understand how we can ultimately enhance the values to the buyers. And so repowering essentially is by increasing the values of our company so that, for example, when we enter this acquisition or bidding process, we can actually stand out and make sure that we can ultimately fulfill the shareholders' value. Now, if you do have concerns regarding the details of these repower, so basically is really to focus on the return on assets point of view. So we laid out, first of all, we look at the market price. But as a small player, there's no way whatsoever for us to maneuver, to secure a less fluctuated price, let's put it that way. But we do have the powers to further increase or improve on the return on assets. And then the most tangible way that we foresee going forward is through repowering.
So I'm just not quite clear. How does this 20% increase in the return on assets come about in a sense that, so what's the incentive of the other party who enter into these PPA with us? What is their incentive? What is it for them to gain?
Right. So for example, for typical buyers, what they want to look at if they do acquire us is they want to look for what are the optimum capacity that we can generate from wind farm going forward, let's say in the next 10 or 20 years. Right now what we see is that typical evaluation of this lifespan of any wind turbine could be rounded up to 30 years. However, since there is regulatory factors, namely the power purchasing agreement, which is only granted to us in 20 years, meaning that there's an intrinsic 10-year loss. So we want to gain that back in the first place. Once we establish that, when we talk to these private buyers or whatnot, we will be at a more strategic edge.
So, but it is subject to negotiation with the government.
Right. So definitely we put it as one of the key risks that we do want to incorporate in part of our strategy. But we do believe that as New Zealand government is really determined to push for these renewable energy, specifically in wind going forward, we do believe that this process will be quite smooth.
But that would not be specifically for our company, right? So what I'm saying is, let's say if the government is extending similar deals with different wind farms, so that wouldn't really put us at an advantage when we're trying to sell to potential buyers, because probably other wind farms will seek similar arrangements.
I guess another characteristics regarding this tactics is that it's time-bound. And the reason why it's time-bound is normally companies wouldn't do that at any point of time. They only do that when they start entering the privatization process, in which, if you go to the previous slides, you can see that once we go into privatization, this acts as a tactic to further boost up our values. Otherwise, in normal circumstances, of course, in terms of generating higher return on assets, we might consider upgrade or further tap into other sources.
Alice, you have a Thai.
Yes. But not from me.
Oh, hi. Okay. Yep. conflict of interest 㗎你。
No. Any conflict. So your question. Yeah, he got more questions because he is basically he knows the case and then he knows the industry better, so he can give more insights.
So can you talk to me a little bit about, you mentioned the portfolio effect. How does that actually help the larger businesses? Why do they have an advantage in that respect that you mentioned?
What did you say?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering, you talked a lot about the portfolio effect, but I'm still not really understanding why that's of value. How does that allow greater generation of value?
Right. Okay. So as you can see from this graph, when we talk about larger players, there's actually a report from DNVGL that if a buyer holds a portfolio of 6 assets or above, usually the report was based on 3 solar assets and 3 wind assets. This actually boosts up our portfolio by around 4.8% in terms of the P90 generation level, meaning that 90% of our chance, if it is a standalone asset, would be 4.8% lower than if it was a portfolio. So that actually boosts up our value because when the buyers look at it, they look at P90 values because P50 values is subject to a lot of fluctuations. So buyers, a lot of them look at the P90 value and talk about the price they're willing to actually give us. So when we're talking about value, we're talking about purchase price. And we talk about purchase price, we believe that larger buyers would enjoy this unique portfolio effect that we talked about, and which bumps up our eventual selling price.
Is that value that you're talking about, is that just a financial diversification of assets, or is there something intrinsic within the industry that is driving that value?
It's something related to the asset, but it's also something that any portfolio would enjoy, as long as the number would be greater if it is more diversified in terms of technology. I mean the generation method. If you have a wide range of geothermal energy, wind energy, hydro, then the portfolio effect would be larger. And if your geography is more widespread, the effect will also be larger. So basically, these two are the diversification aspects that we're talking about.
Why do those two aspects drive the value? How does it drive value in the market?
Right. So actually, today we're not really looking at driving extra value, but it's about we hold these value originally with our great assets, but are we the one to really realize the full value that we're holding today? We see that without a portfolio, we actually cannot, we're missing out a lot of the value that we indirectly hold. But with a portfolio like what Jonathan mentioned, in terms of geographies, in terms of different energy sources, in terms of different plants even, the diversification really helps offset and compensates for different energies fluctuations, which is what is actually the current barrier that as a silo company, we may not be able to address to reach profitability.
It's similar to holding a stock and holding a stock portfolio. The return and the risk analysis is similar illustration with renewable power as well.
Yeah. I guess for me it just sounds like I understand why that's a driver for selling out to an alternative buyer, but actually most of the value that you're mentioning is actually value held by the buyers, right? So why would they pay you extra for those assets? Any buyer that's reasonably large should be holding that value that you mentioned, right?
We do
There's no
see.
incentive for them to pay you higher prices for purchasing your company.
Right, certainly. So one of the buyers that we mentioned is one of the potential type of buyer is that from the current big players in New Zealand, such as Genesis, they're actually looking into these type of diversification. But if we look at their current wind capacity, we see that a lot of them still do not have any wind capacity. What it means is that this is the trend, but there are still a lot of potential big buyers out there that is in desperate, like they're also actively looking for targets like us, which is why we believe this will be a rather smooth process.
Thank you.
Have you considered how much or what is the price range that we have in mind if we sell a company?
Right. Yeah. So we're basically looking at. So we're basically looking at a valuation of around 12.3 times EV/EBITDA, assuming the entry EV/EBITDA is equal to our exit EV/EBITDA. We believe that we're able to sell the company at an equity value of around 50 million.
Then, how are we going to persuade the buyers that we're going to sustain our EBITDA in the coming, say, 3 to 5 years?
Right. Right. I believe. Previous page. I think the good thing about renewables energy is it acts very much like a bond. Obviously, there are seasonality effect within the year. However, actually, if you look in a long term, for example, 5 years to 10 years, it actually the return is quite steady, and the EBITDA, the cash generation from EBITDA and also the EBITDA itself is actually relatively steady. If you look into the long term, a lot of renewables plants, their EBITDA level does not change much throughout the period, and their cash flow generation is almost 100%. So from EBITDA to cash flow. So when we look into these three factors, we believe these are key drivers that will slightly increase our EBITDA going forward, but will not change much.
The EBITDA you use is just from last year, is it?
Yes, the projections that we use.
Then when we look at our financial history, I think it's one of the first few years that we actually made positive EBITDA. So as a buyer, where you think, oh, you're just giving me the best outcome over the past few years, and you charge it on the higher end of the EBITDA ratio, and then you ask me to pay the price.
Right. I think it also goes back to why we achieved this turnaround in 2018. So one of the major reasons is that we tapped into the elective curtailment, which actually helped us maintain a much more efficient operation. And we also understand that you have been actively looking into adding more variables into this model so that this model will be even more efficient in saving our operation expenses. So we see that the turnaround in 2018 will actually be likely to sustain afterwards, given that we have a positive outlook in terms of the operation efficiency, and if the buyer really tap into this deal, they can also achieve a much better top line.
Do you recommend? So building on that, do you think it will be better for us to wait a few years so that we can establish a track record to show that, we don't just have one good year and then we are eager to sell, but we are actually quite confident that this positive outlook will continue for a few years?
Sure. I think that's a great consideration as well regarding the timing of selling the asset. Obviously, we believe, looking at the share price, it has remained relatively steady and relatively low in the past several years. We believe this would be a good time to sell as well. But that's a great point on building a track record, and we believe we will take into that consideration.
Do the Kiwis have any more questions? The Kiwis in Toronto.
He can talk about the industry actually a little bit more on how it operates, because I don't think that you guys did lots of research yet, so his contribution is to fill you in the gaps right now. On the utility market and the player in New Zealand, and then we will go to bed.
Okay, sure. We sit around or else we can't hear.
係喎，係喎。